Duke Sebastian didn't even look at her when he raised his glass, toasting to the flawless, silent grace of his household, while Isabella's heart was screaming in the vacuum of his neglect. He laughed at a joke from the Earl of Pembroke, his eyes bright with social triumph, completely oblivious to the single, hot tear that had finally breached Isabella's lashes to stain her emerald silk. Within 3 sentences of his toast, the shock finally registered, not because he saw her pain, but because he realized the room had gone silent not for his words, but for the way she was trembling. For 3 years, the secret had been the rot beneath the floorboards of Ravenscroft Manor. The Duke didn't just ignore his wife. He had systematically erased her, replacing her soul with a list of rigid protocols until she was nothing more than a ghost in a green gown. The stakes were no longer just her reputation or her title. They were the very last embers of her sanity. As Sebastian's jaw tightened, not in concern, but in cold annoyance that her display was ruining his moment, a new shadow crossed the ballroom floor. Lord Nathaniel Ashford didn't wait for an introduction. He reached past the Duke's frozen authority and firmly grasped Isabella's limp hand. Tonight, the world would learn that a woman who has been treated like a ghost will eventually find a man who isn't afraid of the dark. The candlelight in the grand ballroom of Almack's felt less like a celebration and more like a spotlight on a crime scene. Isabella stood perfectly still, her ribcage aching under the constriction of her corset and the even tighter constriction of her husband's expectations. Sebastian was only 3 feet away, his midnight black tailcoat cutting a sharp, imposing silhouette against the gold-leafed walls. He was the son of this social solar system, and Isabella was merely a moon, cold, reflective, and only allowed to shine when he deemed it necessary. "You're slouching, Isabella," Sebastian murmured, his voice a low, clinical blade that cut through the music of the violins. He didn't turn his head to look at her as he spoke. His gaze remained fixed on the Duke of Wellington across the room. "A Duchess of Ravenscroft does not wilt like a common weed. Adjust yourself." Isabella felt the sting in her eyes before she could suppress it. She did as she was told, pulling her shoulders back until the silver embroidery on her gown bit into her skin. "I am tired, Sebastian," she whispered, her voice so thin it was almost swallowed by the chatter of the ton. "We have been here for 5 hours. I should like to sit down." "You will sit when the Queen sits," he replied, his tone final. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, his jaw working with a tension that suggested her weariness was a personal insult to his rank. "Your fatigue is a weakness of character. Do not let it show again." He moved away then, not with a parting word or a touch of her hand, but with the casual indifference of a man leaving a piece of luggage behind. Isabella was left standing by the heavy velvet drapes, a shimmer of emerald green in a sea of people who looked through her as if she were made of glass. She watched him join a circle of laughing ministers, his posture relaxed and commanding. He was a different man with them, charming, eloquent, and alive. To them, he was a leader. To her, he was a stone wall. She felt the first tear fall. It was small, a tiny betrayal of her composure, but in the harsh light of the chandeliers, it felt like a mountain collapsing. She lowered her head, hoping the soft, romantic curls of her hair would hide the red rim of her eyes. She felt the weight of every ball she had attended since their wedding day, hundreds of nights spent standing in corners, hundreds of hours spent being the perfectly obedient wife to a man who didn't know the color of her eyes when she was happy. The whispers began then, like the hissing of snakes in the grass. The Dowager Countess of Morley leaned into her daughter's ear, her fan fluttering like a moth's wing. "Look at her," the old woman hissed. "The ghost of Ravenscroft. He treats her like a prize horse he's grown bored of. A pity. She was such a vibrant girl before the vows." Isabella gripped her silk fan so hard the ivory ribs groaned. She wanted to scream, to shatter the crystal glasses, to demand that someone, anyone, acknowledge that she was still breathing, but the rules were her cage. She was a Hawthorne by birth and a Ravenscroft by marriage. She was built to endure. Then the air in the ballroom changed. It wasn't a gradual shift. It was a sudden, violent drop in pressure that made the hair on Isabella's neck stand up. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall didn't just open, they seemed to surrender. A man stepped through the threshold, and the violins faltered, the notes dying in a dissonant scrape of bows. He wasn't dressed in the severe blacks and whites of the London elite. He wore a waistcoat of defiant, predatory crimson, the color of fresh blood and old sins. His boots clicked against the polished floor with a rhythmic, dangerous intent. Lord Nathaniel Ashford, the man the Duke had spent years trying to ruin, the man who had been whispered about in every darkened carriage for a decade. Nathaniel didn't look at the king. He didn't look at the ministers. He didn't even acknowledge the Duke of Wellington. His eyes, dark and filled with a terrifyingly focused heat, locked onto the corner of the room where a woman in emerald stood alone. He walked through the crowd like a wolf through a flock of sheep. People parted before him, their faces pale with a mix of horror and fascination. Sebastian, noticing the sudden silence, turned around, his glass of scotch pausing halfway to his lips. His face transformed from arrogant boredom to a mask of cold, lethal fury. "Ashford," Sebastian snapped, stepping forward to intercept him. "You were not invited. This is a private." Nathaniel didn't stop. He didn't even blink. He walked right past the Duke, his shoulder brushing Sebastian's black coat with a deliberate, insulting force. He stopped directly in front of Isabella. For the first time in 3 years, someone was looking at her, not at her gown, not at her title, but into her. Nathaniel saw the red-rimmed eyes. He saw the way her hand trembled against the emerald silk. He saw the ghost and decided to bring her back to life. "Lady Isabella," Nathaniel said, his voice a rich, low velvet that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. He didn't bow. He didn't wait for Sebastian's permission. He simply reached out and took her limp, cold hand in his. His palm was warm, searingly so. It was a shock to her system, a jolt of electricity that forced her to look up, her tear-stained face fully exposed to the room. "You look as though you are drowning in this room," Nathaniel whispered, loud enough for the Duke to hear. "Allow me to be your shore." "Take your hands off my wife." Sebastian's voice roared, his composure finally shattering. He lunged forward, his hand snapping out to grab Isabella's other wrist, his grip like a shackle of cold iron. Isabella gasped, physically sandwiched between the two men. One held her with the desperate, angry grip of a man protecting his property, the other held her with the firm, inviting strength of a man offering a choice. The hand grab was more than a physical struggle, it was the moment the silence of Isabella's life was broken forever. The entire court of England held its breath. The Duke's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on Nathaniel with a possessive rage that Isabella had never seen directed at her in love. "She is mine, Ashford," Sebastian hissed, his fingers digging into Isabella's skin. "Let her go." Nathaniel's smirk was predatory, his eyes never leaving Isabella. "She was yours, Sebastian, but you forgot the first rule of power. If you don't value what you own, someone else will." Isabella looked at the black sleeve of her husband and the crimson sleeve of the man who had just saved her from invisibility. The tear on her cheek finally fell, landing on the hand that didn't want to let her go. Isabella awoke to the soft, grey light creeping through the tall sash windows of Ravenscroft Manor, a light that seemed almost cruel in its serenity. The room was immaculate, but sterile, every velvet curtain and polished mahogany surface, a reminder of the walls that held her more tightly than any lock or chain. She moved quietly, as if even the smallest noise might summon the Duke from somewhere within the house, ready to scold her for some imagined slight. The kettle hissed in the corner of her small sitting room, a timid rebellion against the silence. Isabella poured the tea with careful precision, letting the amber liquid swirl in her delicate porcelain cup. She raised it to her lips, hoping the warmth would reach deeper than her throat, into the hollow she felt growing inside her chest. But even the tea was lukewarm, a mirror of the hospitality she rarely received in these gilded halls. Her reflection caught her attention in the tall mirror propped against the far wall. The green silk of her gown clung to her like a second skin, elegant but oppressive, the emerald threads catching the early morning light as if mocking her. She studied her own face, the pale, sharp angles, the dark circles forming beneath eyes that had seen too many sleepless nights, and for a moment she thought she recognized a stranger. One who smiled rarely, who moved cautiously, who counted the moments until the next social engagement where she would be displayed but never seen. A soft knock at the door made her flinch. "Enter," she murmured, though no one waited for permission. The housemaid, a timid girl named Clara, slipped in with the Duke's meticulously folded papers clutched to her chest. "Your tea, milady," she whispered, placing the cup on the small side table. Isabella nodded, forcing a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she handed over the Duke's latest instructions. Isabella unfolded the sheet, her fingers brushing against the ink as though the words themselves might burn her. The list was long, precise, and chillingly impersonal. "Do not speak to any nobleman before his arrival. Walk no faster than he deems appropriate. Smile at Lady Grantham, but not too long. Stand by the left dais when the music begins." She read each line, committing them to memory as if she were preparing for a battlefield rather than a ballroom. Each instruction was another link in the chain that bound her to the Duke, another reminder that her presence was meant to be invisible, obedient, and wholly contained within the constraints of his will. Isabella set the paper down, the clack of inked letters echoing in the empty room like the final note of a dirge. The sound of distant footsteps in the hallway made her stiffen. The Duke's shadow fell across the doorway before he even entered, a man in a tailored navy coat, sharp as the winter frost that always seemed to follow him. His eyes lingered for a moment too long on the cup in her hand, the faint steam curling into the air, as though he could measure the depth of her resignation by the tilt of her chin. "Breakfast will be ready shortly," he said, his voice low, clipped. He didn't ask how she slept, didn't acknowledge her at all except in the way that a general might acknowledge a soldier. Presence noted, personal concerns irrelevant. Isabella nodded, her mouth dry, but she kept her gaze steady. No words would betray her impatience, her frustration, her quiet longing for acknowledgement. Once the Duke left, she returned to the window, staring out over the dew-drenched gardens that stretched like a sea of green into the mist. The fountains were still, the hedges trimmed with obsessive precision, yet the serenity of the morning did nothing to ease the tension coiling in her chest. Every morning was the same, measured movements, careful observance, and the knowledge that every choice she made could be dissected by the Duke later, when the world was still and she was alone. She sipped her tea again, the liquid no longer holding promise of warmth, but simply a ritual, a reminder that she had to maintain composure for the impending storm of the ball. Today, the Duke would parade her before the glittering elite of London, another week of silent scrutiny and rehearsed courtesy. She was to smile at precisely the right moments, to avoid eye contact with the men who sought to measure her worth, and to appear radiant despite the gnawing exhaustion that had settled into her bones. Isabella's thoughts drifted briefly to Nathaniel, the shadow that had crossed the ballroom floor the night before. A single, decisive gesture had broken through the suffocating wall of neglect, and though the memory brought a flutter of warmth, it was quickly drowned by the reality of her position. The Duke would notice her every movement, every expression. Her heart might race at another man's audacity, but she was still his possession, still bound by the iron rules he had imposed. She rose from her chair, straightening her gown, letting her fingers linger for a moment over the folds of silk. The list of rules waited on the sideboard, each line a command she could not disobey, yet each also a silent invitation to rebellion. She would follow them, of course, she had no choice, but the fire Nathaniel had ignited lingered in her chest, a quiet, dangerous warmth that promised the possibility of defiance, of life beyond the emerald prison she had come to know as home. With careful steps, she moved toward the door, her reflection in the polished wood showing a woman who had learned to navigate the delicate edge between compliance and self-preservation. Today, she would be measured, inspected, and admired. But she would also remember the taste of independence she had glimpsed in the brief touch of another hand. The day ahead promised scrutiny and etiquette, laughter and whispered gossip, but beneath it all, Isabella's heart beat quietly with the knowledge that even in the coldest halls of Ravenscroft Manor, she could still find a way to be seen. And so she descended the stairs, the faint click of her heels against marble announcing her presence before she even reached the breakfast room. The Duke's gaze would follow, the room would hold its collective breath, and she would smile, not the empty, obedient smile the world expected, but a quiet, controlled spark that belonged entirely to her. The emerald prison was vast, but for the first time in a long while, Isabella felt something stir beyond the walls. The carriage ride to Almack's was a study in suffocating silence, the kind that had defined Isabella's life since the day she exchanged her father's debts for a ducal coronet. Inside the cramped, velvet-lined space, the scent of Sebastian's expensive sandalwood cologne felt like a physical weight. He sat opposite her, his spine a rigid line of uncompromising black wool, his eyes fixed on a ledger he had brought along, as if the most important night of the social season were merely a business meeting he was forced to attend. Isabella smoothed the shimmering emerald silk of her skirts, her fingers catching on the delicate silver embroidery. She had spent 3 hours at her dressing table, hopping for a single word of approval, a flicker of warmth in his steel-gray eyes. Instead, he had entered her dressing room, glanced at her reflection as if checking the polish on a piece of silver, and remarked that her necklace sat a fraction of an inch too low. "Remember, Isabella," Sebastian said, finally closing the ledger as the carriage slowed to a halt amidst the sea of flickering lanterns outside the club. "The Prime Minister will be in attendance tonight. You are to remain at my side while we navigate the foyer, but once I am engaged in the smoking room, you are to find the Dowager Countess and stay within her circle. I will not have you wandering the floor like a common debutante." "I thought perhaps we might share the first dance," Isabella ventured, her voice small against the rattling of the carriage wheels. "It has been months, Sebastian." He looked at her then, a cold, clinical gaze that made her feel smaller than the dust on the floorboards. "We are not here for romance, Isabella. We are here for optics. You are the Duchess of Ravenscroft. Your duty is to look the part, not to play at being a star-crossed lover. Do not make me regret bringing you." When the carriage door opened, the transformation was instantaneous. Sebastian stepped onto the pavement and reached back for her hand, his grip firm and performative. To the onlookers and the photographers of the society papers, he was the picture of a protective, powerful husband. He tucked her arm tightly into his, using her presence as a decorative shield to soften his own severe reputation as he ascended the stairs. Inside, the heat of 1,000 candles and the roar of 100 conversations hit Isabella like a physical blow. Sebastian moved through the crowd with predatory grace, pulling her along in his wake. He stopped to greet an earl here, a baron there, always keeping Isabella positioned just half a step behind him, visible enough to signal his status, but silent enough to never interrupt his flow. Ravenscroft and the lovely Duchess, the Marquis of Hertford, boomed, blocking their path. "A stunning gown, my lady, truly." Isabella opened her mouth to thank him, but Sebastian spoke over her before she could draw breath. "It is a Hawthorne heirloom, Hertford. Suits her station, does it not? Now, about that motion in the House of Lords." Isabella's smile froze. She was a prop, a beautiful emerald accessory designed to signal Sebastian's refined taste and traditional values. As they moved deeper into the ballroom, she felt the shield being discarded. The moment Sebastian spotted the men he truly wished to speak with, his grip on her arm loosened. "Go to the Dowager now," he commanded in a low hiss, his eyes already tracking his political prey. "And Isabella, try not to look so pathetic. It reflects poorly on me." Without a backward glance, he vanished into the thicket of black tailcoats, leaving her stranded on the edge of the dance floor. The transition from being his shield to being a wallflower was so abrupt it left her breathless. Isabella navigated the perimeter of the room, her emerald gown suddenly feeling like a neon sign of her isolation. She reached the designated corner where the elderly matron sat, but the Dowager Countess was deep in a scandalous whisper with her peers. When Isabella approached, the circle didn't open. The older women glanced at her, their eyes raking over her tear-rimmed gaze and her solitary state, before turning back to their secrets. She was the ghost of Ravenscroft once more. She retreated to a shadowed alcove near the velvet drapes, her back against the cold stone wall. From here, she watched the world move in vibrant color. She saw wives being led to the floor with smiles and daughters laughing behind fans. She saw Sebastian across the room, his head thrown back in a rare, genuine laugh as he shared a cigar with a cabinet minister. He was perfectly happy without her. He was more alive in her absence than he ever was in her presence. A single tear, hot and rebellious, escaped the corner of her eye. She didn't wipe it away. She let it track down her cheek, a silver line of grief on an emerald background. She felt the heavy weight of the Hawthorne diamonds around her neck, each stone feeling like a link in a chain. She was the most beautiful woman in the room, and she was utterly, devastatingly alone. She closed her eyes for a moment, wishing the floor would simply open up and swallow her, hiding her from the pitying stares of the ton. She prayed for a change, any change, to break the frozen cycle of her life. She didn't know that across the room, near the great oak doors, a man in a crimson waistcoat had just arrived, and he was looking for the only woman in the room who wasn't dancing. The heavy oak doors of Olmax didn't just open, they groaned as if the very hinges recognized the weight of the man standing behind them. In a room governed by the muted tones of traditional black wool and the predictable shimmer of pastels, the figure that stepped into the light was a violent intrusion. Lord Nathaniel Ashford stood in the threshold, draped in a waistcoat of deep, predatory crimson that seemed to pulse against the golden glow of the chandeliers. The music didn't stop all at once. It faltered in sections, the cellos trailing off into a confused vibration as the dancers slowed to a halt. The air, previously thick with the scent of lilies and expensive tobacco, suddenly sharpened with the metallic tang of an approaching storm. Nathaniel didn't offer a bow to the musicians or a nod to the patronesses. He simply stood there, his silhouette a sharp, defiant tear in the fabric of the evening. Isabella, tucked away in her shadowed alcove, felt the shift before she saw the cause. The oppressive chill that had settled into her bones during Sebastian's abandonment was suddenly replaced by a prickle of heat at the nape of her neck. She watched as the sea of guests parted, not with the graceful flow of a choreographed dance, but with the frantic urgency of a flock of birds sensing a hawk. "Is that Ashford?" the Dowager Countess hissed, her fans snapping shut with a sound like a pistol shot. "After the scandal in Vienna, he has the audacity to show his face here." Isabella's breath hitched. She had heard the stories, the duels fought over women's honors, the fortunes won and lost on a single turn of a card, and the legendary defiance of a man who refused to bow to the Duke of Ravenscroft's political machine. Nathaniel Ashford was everything Sebastian was not. He was chaos wrapped in fine silk, a man who lived in the light of his own desires rather than the shadows of proper society. Nathaniel began to move. He didn't slink along the perimeter like Isabella had. He carved a path directly through the center of the ballroom. His boots clicked against the parquet floor with a rhythmic, lethal intent. He looked neither left nor right, ignoring the gasps and the frantic whispers that followed in his wake. His eyes, dark and filled with a terrifyingly focused heat, were fixed on a single point in the vast room. Sebastian, standing near the punch bowl with a group of stern-faced ministers, went rigid. Isabella saw her husband's hand tighten around his crystal glass until his knuckles turned a ghostly white. The arrogant smirk he had worn all evening vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, murderous territoriality. He took a step forward, his midnight black tailcoat making him look like a wall of shadow intended to block the sun. But Nathaniel didn't stop. He walked past the Duke as if Sebastian were nothing more than a common servant, his shoulder brushing against the Duke, with a deliberate, insulting force that sent ripples of shock through the crowd. The temperature in the room seemed to rise 10 degrees as Nathaniel approached Isabella's alcove. The ghost of Ravenscroft found herself unable to move, her back pressed against the cold stone as the man in crimson came to a halt mere inches away. Up close, he smelled of rain, cedar, and something dangerously untamed. "They told me you had become a statue, Isabella," Nathaniel said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that cut through the silence like a cello's bow. He didn't use her title. He spoke her name as if it were a secret he had been keeping for a lifetime. But statues don't bleed, and they certainly don't cry. Isabella felt a fresh tear escape her lashes, but before it could fall, Nathaniel reached out. He didn't touch her face. That would have been a scandal beyond repair, but he caught the droplet on the back of his hand, watching it shimmer against the crimson of his cuff. The room was so silent that the flickering of the candles sounded like a roar. Sebastian's voice, when it finally broke the quiet, was a jagged edge of ice. "Ashford, you are treading on dangerous ground. Get away from my wife." Nathaniel turned his head just enough to acknowledge the Duke, a predatory smirk playing on his lips. "Your wife? I see a duchess, certainly. I see a hawthorn heirloom, but I see no wife, Sebastian. A wife is a woman you look at, a woman you cherish. You've treated her like a trophy on a dusty shelf for so long you've forgotten she has a heart." The Duke lunged forward, his face contorted with a possessive rage that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with his shattered ego. "I will have you escorted out in chains." "Then do it," Nathaniel challenged, his eyes snapping back to Isabella, his gaze searing through her emerald silk. "But while you're calling for the guards, I'm going to do what you haven't had the courage to do in 3 years." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't ask for permission. Nathaniel reached out and took Isabella's hand. His palm was burning, a stark contrast to the frozen neglect she had endured. In that moment, the crimson scandal didn't just enter the room, he set Isabella's world on fire. The heavy, humid air of the conservatory smelled of crushed jasmine and damp earth, a stark departure from the suffocating dust and perfume of the ballroom. Isabella had fled the crowded floor the moment the Duke had been pulled into a heated debate regarding the corn laws, slipping through the French doors like a ghost seeking its grave. She stood now in the deepest shadow of a towering fern, her breath hitching in jagged sobs that she tried to stifle with the back of her hand. She felt like a fractured thing. The emerald silk of her gown, which had felt like armor hours ago, now felt like a shroud. She was the Duchess of Ravenscroft, a title that carried the weight of 1,000 ancestors, yet in the dark of the garden, she felt like absolutely no one at all. "The shadows don't suit you, Isabella." The voice didn't come from the direction of the ballroom. It emerged from the darkness near the stone fountain, low and vibrating with a resonant warmth that made her heart hammer against her ribs. Isabella spun around, her hand flying to the hawthorn diamonds at her throat. Nathaniel Ashford stepped into the sliver of moonlight filtering through the glass ceiling. The crimson of his waistcoat looked almost black in the low light, but his eyes were bright, fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see every bruise on her soul. "You shouldn't be here, Lord Nathaniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "If my husband finds you." "Your husband is currently explaining the virtues of iron-fisted governance to a group of men who are too bored to listen," Nathaniel interrupted, stepping closer. He didn't stop until he was within her personal space, breaching the invisible boundary that the rest of the world respected out of fear of the Duke. "He won't miss you for another hour. He's too busy being the Duke to remember he has a wife." Isabella looked away, her gaze falling to the moss-covered stones at their feet. "I am the Duchess. My place is where he designates it." "There it is again," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a soft, dangerous silk. "The title, the rank, the hollow shell Sebastian built around you." He reached out not to touch her, but to gently tilt a fern frond away from her face. "I didn't come out here to speak to the Duchess of Ravenscroft. I've met a dozen duchesses, and they all have the same frozen expression and the same rehearsed smiles." He took another step, forcing her to look up at him. The moonlight caught the silver embroidery on her dress, making it shimmer like moonlight on water. "I want to know who is left when the jewels come off," he murmured. "Tell me, what is your name?" Isabella blinked, the question catching her completely off guard. "You know my name. It was announced when we entered. Lady Isabella Hawthorne, Duchess of—" "No," Nathaniel countered, his eyes burning into hers. "That is who you belong to. That is the ledger entry in your father's books and your husband's estate. I am asking for the name of the girl who used to ride horses at a gallop before she was told it was unladylike. The girl who reads Keats in the middle of the night because the silence of her bedroom is too loud." Isabella felt a lump form in her throat, a physical manifestation of the years of repressed identity. No one had asked for her name in 3 years. To Sebastian, she was my dear, or the Duchess, or more often, a silent pronoun in a sentence about his own house. "Isabella," she breathed, the word feeling foreign and heavy on her tongue. "Isabella," he repeated, the vowels rolling off his lips like a prayer. He reached out then, his thumb grazing the back of her hand where it rested against the stone plinth of the fountain. His skin was searingly hot, a living, breathing heat that defied the cold stone and the colder marriage she inhabited. "It's a beautiful name. It sounds like music that's been muffled by a heavy curtain." "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why come back now? Why look at me when everyone else has learned to look through me?" "Because I remember the girl in the orchard 10 years ago," Nathaniel said, his thumb drawing a slow, deliberate circle on her skin. "Before the Duke's shadow fell over you, I spent 5 years in exile thinking about the light in your eyes, only to return and find that he's spent his time trying to put it out." He leaned in closer, his scent of cedar and rain enveloping her. "He treats you like property, Isabella, but property doesn't have a name, you do, and I think it's time you started using it." In the distance, the faint sound of the Duke's voice calling for a servant echoed through the open doors, sharp and demanding. The spell was broken. Isabella instinctively pulled her hand away, the sudden loss of his warmth feeling like a physical wound. "I have to go," she whispered, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and longing. "Go then," Nathaniel said, stepping back into the shadows but keeping his gaze locked on hers. "Go back to being his Duchess, but remember, Isabella, a ghost can only haunt a house for so long before it decides to leave." As she hurried back toward the light of the ballroom, her heart was no longer a hollow vessel. It was beating, frantic and terrified, but undeniably alive, repeating the name he had given back to her over and over again. The transition from the cool, damp silence of the conservatory back into the golden glare of the ballroom felt like a descent into a gilded furnace. Isabella stepped through the French doors, her heart still hammering against her ribs with the rhythm of the name Nathaniel had restored to her. She smoothed her emerald skirts, desperate to appear as the perfectly obedient statue Sebastian demanded, but the heat in her cheeks was a treasonous bloom she couldn't suppress. She found her husband where she had left him, standing in the center of a circle of grim-faced diplomats. Sebastian didn't greet her. He didn't even check to see if she was unharmed. He simply reached out and gripped her elbow, his fingers digging into the silk and the flesh beneath with a bruising possessiveness that felt more like a brand than a touch. "You've been gone for 12 minutes, Isabella," he murmured, his voice a low, vibrating threat beneath his public smile. "The Austrian ambassador was asking for you. Do not let your flights of fancy embarrass me again." "I only needed air, Sebastian," she whispered, her head downcast. "You need nothing but to fulfill your obligations," he replied, his gaze already shifting back to his peers. He was done with her, his property reclaimed and accounted for. But the room didn't return to its comfortable, stagnant peace. The orchestra began to tune their instruments for the Waltz of the Hearts, a melody so intimate and sweeping that it was traditionally reserved for those with the deepest of understandings. The tune began to shift, couples moving to the floor, but a sudden, sharp silence cut through the tuning of the violins. Nathaniel Ashford had returned to the floor. He moved through the crowd not like a guest, but like a conqueror. The crimson of his waistcoat seemed to burn brighter under the 1,000 candles of the chandeliers. He ignored the gasps of the patronesses and the indignant huffs of the earls, walking with a singular, lethal focus toward the Duke of Ravenscroft. Sebastian went rigid. He didn't let go of Isabella's arm. Instead, his grip tightened until she nearly gasped. To Sebastian, this was no longer a party, it was a siege. Nathaniel stopped exactly 3 paces away. He didn't acknowledge the Duke's presence with so much as a blink. He looked directly at Isabella, his dark eyes filled with a searing, predatory heat that made the hawthorn diamonds at her throat feel like ice. "Lady Isabella," Nathaniel said, his voice carrying through the hushed room like a bell, "the music is beginning. I find myself in need of a partner who understands the difference between a dance and a display. Will you give me this waltz?" The scandal was instantaneous. For a man to ask a duchess for such a dance, bypassing her husband entirely, was a declaration of war. The whispers rose like a swarm of hornets. Sebastian's face transformed. The cold, calculated mask of the Duke shattered, revealing a raw, jagged ego underneath. He stepped in front of Isabella, his shadow swallowing her whole. "You overstep, Ashford. My wife does not dance with men of your reputation. We are leaving." "I wasn't asking you, Sebastian," Nathaniel replied, his voice dangerously smooth. He stepped around the Duke's shoulder, his gaze never leaving Isabella's face. He reached out his hand, palm up, an open invitation that looked like a lifeline in a drowning sea. "I was asking Isabella." Sebastian's jaw worked with a rhythmic, violent tension. The ignored wife, the woman he had spent years treating as a silent piece of furniture, was suddenly the most valuable prize in the room. He could feel the eyes of the entire London elite upon them, judging his strength, weighing his control. "She is staying at my side," Sebastian hissed, his voice trembling with a possessive rage. He didn't look at Isabella's face, he looked at Nathaniel's hand as if he wanted to sever it. "Isabella, tell him you decline, now." Isabella looked at her husband's tightening grip on her arm, a grip that promised a lifetime of cold corridors and silent rooms. Then she looked at Nathaniel's open hand. For the first time in her life, she saw a man who wasn't looking at the Duchess, but at the girl in the orchard who wanted to run. "The music is starting, Sebastian," Isabella said, her voice surprisingly steady, though her heart was a wild thing in her chest. "Isabella," the Duke warned, his eyes flashing with a lethal warning. The challenge was set. The ballroom had become a battlefield, and Isabella was no longer the shield. She was the ground they were fighting for, and for the first time in 3 years, she realized she had the power to choose who won. She looked at Nathaniel's hand, then back at her husband's iron-like hold, and the silence in the room became a deafening roar of expectation. The first notes of the Waltz of the Hearts rose from the orchestra like a haunting lament, yet no one on the floor moved to dance. The air in the center of the ballroom had become a vacuum, drawing every eye in Olmec to the triad of emerald, black, and crimson. Isabella felt the vibration of the violins in her very teeth, but her world had narrowed down to the 2 men who held her in a terrifying, public equilibrium. Sebastian's grip on her left wrist was no longer the calculated hold of a husband. It was the crushing shackle of a master who sensed his property was about to bolt. His fingers dug into the delicate silver embroidery of her sleeve, the pressure so intense she could feel the pulse thrumming in her own veins. His face was a mask of aristocratic iron, but beneath it, his eyes were wide with a frantic, wounded pride. "You will not move." "Isabella," Sebastian hissed, his voice a low, lethal vibration meant only for her. "To take his hand is to end your life as you know it. Think of your name. Think of the shame you will bring to this house." But Isabella wasn't thinking of the house. She was thinking of the bruises he had left on her soul during 3 years of silence. Nathaniel didn't flinch at the Duke's threat. He stepped closer, so close that the heat of his crimson waistcoat seemed to radiate against her skin, a stark contrast to the icy draft blowing from the conservatory. He didn't grab her. Instead, he reached out and firmly grasped her right hand, his fingers lacing through hers in a way that felt like a promise rather than a prison. "His grip is for the world to see, Isabella," Nathaniel whispered, his voice steady and rich. "Mine is only for you. He holds you to keep his crown straight. I hold you because I know you're the only thing in this room that's actually alive." The physical tug-of-war began. It was subtle to the distant observers, the shifting of shoulders, the tension in the arms, but to Isabella it was a brutal dissection. Sebastian pulled her toward him, a sharp, demanding jerk intended to force her back into her place behind his shoulder. Nathaniel didn't pull back with force. He held his ground, his hand an anchor, offering her the stability she had never found in her marriage. "Let her go, Ashford," Sebastian's voice finally broke, rising above the music. The perfect Duke was gone, replaced by a man whose jaw was tight with the humiliation of being challenged. "She is my wife, my Duchess. You have no right to touch her." "I have the right of a man who sees her," Nathaniel countered, his smirk predatory as he looked the Duke in the eye. "Something you haven't done since the day the dowry cleared." Isabella stood paralyzed, sandwiched between the cold authority of her past and the dangerous heat of a potential future. She looked at Sebastian, his severe midnight black coat, the high white cravat that looked like a noose, and the intense gaze that was fixed on Nathaniel, never on her. He wasn't fighting for her heart. He was fighting for the hand that belonged to the Duke of Ravenscroft. Then she looked at Nathaniel. He was looking only at her. He wasn't intimidated by the rank, the scandal, or the Duke's mounting rage. His hold was an invitation, a reaching out that dared her to believe she was more than a ghost. A single tear tracked down Isabella's cheek, shimmering like a diamond in the candlelight. The V-shape of the confrontation reached its breaking point. The whispering crowd drew a collective breath as Isabella's hand, limp and paralyzed until now, suddenly twitched. She felt the iron of Sebastian's grip and the warmth of Nathaniel's palm. For 3 years, she had been a decorative piece of property, allowing the interaction of her life to happen to her rather than participating in it. But as the waltz reached its crescendo, the ignored Duchess did the unthinkable. She didn't just pull away, she made a choice. Her fingers, which had been frozen in Nathaniel's grasp, suddenly tightened, gripping him back with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Isabella, stop this madness," Sebastian commanded, his voice cracking with a sudden, belated flash of panic. For the first time, he looked at her face, but it was too late. He was looking at a woman who had already left the room in her mind. The hand-grab tension snapped. Isabella didn't look back at the Duke as she began the agonizing process of letting go of the man she had been told to obey. The silence that followed was the loudest moment of her life, a thunderclap that signaled the end of the Ravenscroft era and the beginning of the scandal that would set her free. The crescendo of the violins seemed to scream in Isabella's ears, a frantic, rising tide that matched the thundering of her own blood. She was suspended in a nightmare of silk and silver, her body a bridge between two worlds that were tearing her apart. To her left, the Duke's grip was a shackle of cold iron, his fingers bruising her wrist as if he could physically weld her back to his side. To her right, Nathaniel's hand was a hearth, a steady, pulsing warmth that didn't demand her soul but offered to shield it. "Isabella," Sebastian hissed, and for the first time in their marriage, there was a tremor of genuine fear beneath his cold command. He finally looked at her, his gaze raking over her tear-stained face, but even now he didn't see her grief. He only saw the threat to his reputation. "Do not do this. I am your husband. I am your world." "No," Isabella whispered, the word so small it should have been buried by the music, yet it carried the weight of a collapsing mountain. "You are my cage, Sebastian." With a slow, deliberate motion that felt as though she were tearing her own skin, Isabella began to rotate her left wrist within the Duke's grasp. Sebastian's eyes widened, his jaw dropping as he felt her resistance. He tightened his hold, his knuckles turning a ghostly, lethal white, but Isabella did not flinch. The ignored wife, the woman who had spent 1,000 nights shrinking into the shadows of Ravenscroft Manor, suddenly stood tall. She didn't wrench herself away with violence, she simply ceased to belong to him. She pulled her hand back, her fingers slipping from his grasp inch by agonizing inch. As the last contact broke, as her skin finally separated from the midnight black wool of his sleeve, the orchestra's music seemed to vanish into a sudden, suffocating vacuum. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Isabella had ever heard. It wasn't the absence of noise, it was the collective gasp of 500 souls, a physical shockwave that rippled through the ballroom of Almack's. The Dowager Countess's fans stopped mid-flutter. The diplomats froze with their glasses halfway to their lips. In that single, frozen heartbeat, the social order of Regency London cracked down the center. Sebastian stood paralyzed, his hand still suspended in the empty air where her wrist had been. He looked down at his open palm, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The perfect Duke had been publicly discarded, and the humiliation was a visible, bleeding wound on his aristocratic pride. He looked at Isabella as if she were a stranger, a statue that had suddenly grown teeth and bitten the hand that polished it. "Isabella," he breathed, his voice stripped of its clinical edge, sounding hollow and small. She didn't answer him. She didn't even look at the man who had treated her like furniture for 3 years. Instead, she turned her full attention to the man in crimson. Nathaniel Ashford didn't gloat. He didn't look at the Duke with triumph. His focus remained entirely on Isabella, his thumb tracing a slow, grounding circle on the back of her hand. He waited, allowing her the moment of her own liberation. His dark eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight like twin fires. "You've dropped the anchor, Isabella," Nathaniel murmured, his voice the only thing that could pierce the ringing silence. "Now shall we sail?" Isabella took a breath, a real, deep breath that filled her lungs for the first time since her wedding day. She looked at Nathaniel's hand, the hand that had reached out to her in the dark, and she tightened her grip. She wasn't just taking a partner for a waltz, she was reclaiming her name. She stepped away from the Duke, moving into the open space of the dance floor with Nathaniel. As they began the first slow, sweeping rotation of the waltz, the silence broke into a roar of frantic whispers and dropped silverware. Behind them, Sebastian remained standing alone in the center of the room, a midnight black shadow in a world that had suddenly turned vibrant with scandal and crimson. For the first time in her life, Isabella Hawthorne didn't care who was watching. She was no longer a ghost in a green gown. She was a woman dancing on the ruins of her own prison, and the heat of Nathaniel's hand was the only thing that felt real. The sun rose over London not with a gentle warmth, but with the harsh, unforgiving clarity of a courtroom lamp. Inside Ravenscroft Manor, the air was curdled with the scent of stale wax and the cold, metallic tang of Sebastian's fury. The news of the three-way hand grab had travelled faster than the Duke's carriage, and by dawn, the morning papers were already whispering of the Duchess who had danced in crimson while her husband stood frozen in black. Sebastian paced the length of the morning room, his silhouette sharp against the tall windows. He was still in his evening clothes, his cravat untied and hanging like a noose around his neck. When Isabella entered, her spine straight and her face pale but resolute, he stopped, his jaw working with a rhythmic, violent tension. "You will not leave this house, Isabella," he said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that lacked its usual clinical precision. "The gates are locked. The staff has been instructed. You will remain in your chambers until I have managed to suppress this insanity. You have made us a laughingstock." He stepped toward her, his shadow falling over her like a heavy shroud. "You think that because you held his hand for a moment, the world has changed? You are still my wife. You are still bound to me by law, by debt, and by the very name you tried to throw away last night." Isabella didn't flinch. She stood by the mahogany table, the morning light catching the faint purple bruises on her wrist, the silent evidence of his grip from the night before. "The world hasn't changed, Sebastian," she said, her voice steady and devoid of the tremors that had defined her for years. "I have." "Do not test me," he hissed, reaching out as if to seize her arm once more. "I will keep you here until you forget his name. I will make you a ghost in truth, if that is what it takes to preserve the Ravenscroft honor." "You are too late," Isabella countered, sliding a thick, cream-colored envelope across the polished wood toward him. "The locks on the gates are irrelevant. I have already sent word to my father's solicitors and the Dower House. While you were packing this room, imagining how to hide me, I was meeting with the men who handle the Hawthorne Trust." Sebastian froze, his hand hovering over the envelope. "The trust, that money is tied to the marriage contract. You cannot touch it without my signature." "Normally, yes," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, a smile that held no warmth, only the cold fire of a woman who had found her leverage. "But my father was a cautious man. He included a clause regarding physical endangerment and the public neglect of the estate's dignity. Last night, in front of 500 witnesses, you provided all the evidence they needed. I'm not asking for a separation, Sebastian. I am reclaiming my dowry and moving to the Dower House this afternoon." The silence that followed was different from the silence in the ballroom. That had been the silence of shock. This was the silence of a man watching his empire crumble. Sebastian tore open the envelope, his eyes scanning the legal jargon, his face draining of color until he looked as bloodless as the marble statues he so admired. "You would ruin us both for a man who wears crimson," he whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, jagged ego. "I am doing this for the woman who wears emerald," Isabella replied. She turned toward the door, where her lady's maid stood waiting with a single, packed trunk. "You told me once that being a duchess was about optics, Sebastian. Look closely at the optics now. You are standing in an empty room, and for the first time in 3 years, I am the one walking away." As she stepped into the hall, the heavy front doors were thrown open, not by the Duke's staff, but by the legal emissaries she had summoned. The sunlight flooded the foyer, blinding and brilliant, and as Isabella walked through the threshold, she didn't look back at the midnight black shadow of the man who had tried to own her. She was no longer property, she was a woman with a name, and she was finally going home. The gardens of the Hawthorne Dower House did not possess the manicured, stifling perfection of Ravenscroft Manor. Here, the roses grew in wild, exuberant clusters, and the air carried the scent of untamed salt from the nearby coast rather than the stale incense of a mausoleum. 6 months had passed since the scandal at Olmec, and the ton had found new victims to dissect, but the woman who walked the gravel path was unrecognizable as the ghost she had left behind in London. Isabella moved with a lightness that had nothing to do with her station and everything to do with her soul. She was no longer draped in the heavy, envious emerald silk that Sebastian had chosen to mark her as his property, nor was she shrouded in the mourning black he had expected her to wear during their legal separation. Today, she wore a gown of soft, pale gold, the color of a new dawn, with a simple ribbon at her waist. There were no hawthorn diamonds weighing down her neck, no silver embroidery cutting into her skin. She was dressed in her own choices, moving in her own light. Beside her, Nathaniel Ashford walked with the easy, unhurried gait of a man who had finally found the treasure he had been hunting in the dark. He was still the crimson lord to the gossips, but today his waistcoat was a deep, warm plum, and his eyes, once predatory and sharp, held a soft, grounding heat when they turned toward her. He didn't lead her by the elbow. He didn't use her as a shield to navigate the world. He simply walked with her, his hand occasionally brushing hers in a silent, elective touch that sent a thrill of genuine life through her veins. "The lawyers say the final decree will be signed by the month's end," Isabella said. Her voice clear and resonant, no longer a thin whisper lost in the shadows. "Sebastian has retreated to his northern estates. They say he refuses to see anyone. A man who lives for his reflection in the eyes of others will always starve when the mirrors are taken away," Nathaniel replied, stopping near a stone bench that overlooked the sea. He turned to her, his gaze scanning her face not with the clinical inventory of a collector, but with the reverence of a man seeing a miracle. "How does it feel, Isabella, to be the most talked-about woman in England and not care a whit for the conversation?" Isabella looked out at the horizon, where the blue of the water met the gold of the sky. "It feels as though I have finally woken up from a very long, very cold dream. I spent 3 years wondering if I had simply ceased to exist. I thought that if I stopped being the Duchess, there would be nothing left but dust." Nathaniel reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the stone. His palm was still searingly warm, a constant reminder that she was no longer alone in the cold. "And what did you find instead?" "I found that the girl in the orchard never really left," she said, turning her hand over to lace her fingers through his. "She was just waiting for someone to call her name." They stood in silence for a long moment, a silence that wasn't heavy or suffocating, but full of the sound of the wind and the rhythmic pull of the tide. In London, the Duke of Ravenscroft was a name associated with a fallen throne and a broken house. But here, on the cliffs of her own making, Isabella was a new kind of duchess. She was a woman who had dared to drop the hand of a duke to take the hand of a man who loved her, and in doing so, she had become the mistress of her own fate. As they began to walk back toward the house, Nathaniel leaned in, his voice a low, intimate promise. "The world will never forgive us for being happy, you know. They prefer their tragedies in emerald and black." Isabella laughed, a bright, melodic sound that chased away the last lingering ghosts of her past. "Then let them watch us, Nathaniel. Let them see that a scandal is merely what happens when a woman decides she is worth more than the silence she was sold for." The sun began to set, casting their long, intertwined shadows across the wild grass. The new Duchess didn't look back at the dark corridors of her old life. She walked forward, gold in the sunlight, with her hand firmly held by the man who had seen her when she was invisible, moving toward a future where she would never be a ghost again. The story concludes not with a simple rescue, but with a profound awakening. In the quiet freedom of her own estate, Isabella realizes that Sebastian's possessiveness was never love. It was merely the pride of a man who valued his shadow more than the person casting it. By reclaiming her dowry and her name, she has effectively ended the charade of their perfect marriage. As she walks with Nathaniel, she is no longer a piece of property, but a woman who found the strength to walk away while her back was turned to the Duke forever. This tale reflects the enduring truth of human value. Being kept is not the same as being cared for. It serves as a stark reminder that the loudest, most painful silence is the one between two people who were meant to love each other. Sometimes, a scandalous hand reached out in genuine kindness is more honorable than a respectable hand held in cold, manipulative neglect. True strength isn't found in endurance, but in the courage to be seen. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people, give this story a like to stand with Isabella. Do you think she was right to choose the scandal over the Duke's cold security? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe and hit the bell for more tales of Regency rebellion, justice, and hearts set on fire.